Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Thank you, Manthan, for, as always, organizing such a terrific, inviting such a terrific speaker. I must say, of all the Zoom events that I've done in the recent past, this is the one I've been most looking forward to. Amit is my ideal of the kind of political scientist I would like to be if I had more skills and insight. And it's a real privilege to be able to talk to him. This book, Mobilizing the Marginalized, Ethnic Parties Without Ethnic Movements, just won the Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay Award for the best non-fiction book published in 2020, and it's an entirely well-deserved award. Amit, welcome, and really look forward to this conversation. What I thought we would do, the book is ostensibly about the nature of Dalit mobilization and the connection between Dalit social mobilization and political mobilization in India. And we'll talk about the argument in a second. But I think to our viewers, I think it's also worth emphasizing that the book is much more than that. It is one of the most intelligent takes on how voters, particularly from marginalized communities, think of their own sense of agency and their own identities. And we hope to touch on some of those themes as well as the discussion progresses and how it relates to kind of, contemporary India. So, Amit, let me begin with a kind of small question about the book, which kind of goes to the heart of the argument, which is that you argue and you pose a puzzle, and the very fact that you pose this puzzle was a testament to, I think, your insight into Indian politics. The question Amit was asking is, why do ethnic parties like the BSP, right, when you particularly think of Dalit parties, why did a party like that politically flourish more in a state like UP, for example, and not in Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra? Or another way of putting it, why did Dalits did not require their own political party, which succeeded to the same extent that the BSP did in UP and Maharashtra? So the question I wanted, one, how did you actually come to, as it were, formulate the question this way? Because I think it'll also give the viewers some sense of your kind of research process. And then how do you go about, answering this puzzle, as it were, briefly? So floor is yours.
Great. Pratap, thank you very much. My God, that is such a wonderful introduction. I want to thank you for doing this conversation with me, but I also want to thank Manthan, both Ajayji and Vikramji for organizing this event. It's just such a privilege for me to be here, to be part of this conversation today. Pratap, let me just, so it's coming to the question itself, or the formulation of the question itself, that process of discovery took some time, and it was generated more by field experience than by just reading books. Because I went into the field when I started doing my work. I was doing some research on why the poor go to vote in India in large numbers, and how do they think about voting. And as I was traveling and talking to voters, both doing interviews and focus groups, I got interested in this question. And what struck me about Dalit politics while doing this fieldwork across different states was that it wasn't that Dalit parties were not competing in the states that I look at. These are large states in India, 4 large states of, West, in Maharashtra in the west, Tamil Nadu in the south, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar in the north. So, there is a significant part of the Dalit population that lives here, about 43%. 40% of the parliament is elected from these states. And so no surprise that Dalit parties, when in a moment in the 1990s and in the 2000s, when the party system is fragmenting, when the Congress is a state of decline, and there are small parties appearing across India, there was no surprise that Dalit parties were in the running in these states.
Yeah.
But what was interesting is that these parties were not performing similarly in the elections. And what struck me while doing field work, especially in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, was that in these states where the Dalit parties were not doing well, whether it was the RPI or BSP in Maharashtra or the VCK in Tamil Nadu, is that it wasn't that there was no Dalit consciousness. In fact, Dalit consciousness is much higher in these states. These are states where there is a longer history of Dalit politics. And when I spoke to voters, for examples, I found that Dalit consciousness. There was awareness around issues related to caste, and yet that did not translate into the electoral success of Dalit parties. And that's what got me thinking. And when I went back to Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, where there was Dalit party success, where people were aware of their own parties that they were voting for. But when one probed deeper into how deep this consciousness was, historically, how was it rooted? What did they remember of their past? What stories had they heard? What were the conversations that they were having at home about Dalit leaders, about issues of Dalit politics and Dalit history and in their own community history, in their own jatis? I found that it wasn't as deep as one found it in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu. So that's where that's where the puzzle comes from. Why there is this disjuncture between electoral success and strength of social mobilization.
Okay, so let's kind of follow up this argument. I mean, one of the things the book does actually in a nutshell very powerfully is actually give a history of Dalit social consciousness in these different states. You have probably the most comprehensive catalog, for example, of Dalit social organizations in each of these states. Right? Now, there is an old argument in the literature, right, that one of the advantages that Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu have compared to North Indian states is, well, two advantages. One, of course, the level of economic disparity historically. If you look at landowning structures, those kinds of things were not as significant as in the North, right? That's the standard North-South contrast we do whenever we think of why the South generally does well. And the second, of course, was the introduction of education and at least the creation of some vanguard groups like the Mahars in Maharashtra, right? Mm-hmm. Who in then some senses become the kind of early pioneers in sort of thinking about Dalit consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. So if one were to look at in a Bronze Age historical perspective and ask this question, what are the deep underlying social causes that led to this greater social consciousness? We'll come to the political electoral success in a second. Is there something in your fieldwork that would in a sense challenge this proposition that in part this consciousness may just have been a fact that these states were much more mobilized, politicized, egalitarian, socially conscious than perhaps UP and Bihar generally? Or would you want to contest that proposition?
So I think there is no doubt about the fact that there is the historical trajectory in these states is different, and I look at that in the book. I sort of systematic. But what is interesting is that in some ways there are lots of these factors that are coming together. It's the introduction of ideas at a particular time, which is much earlier in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, in both states, of Dalit emancipation or in general emancipatory ideas. it's the kind of economic activity which is happening in these states that pulls Dalits out of rural areas into cities. It's the appearance of these leaders, but and in some ways incubation of these ideas, but also the transmission of these ideas back to villages, through stories, through protests, through mobilization. And so all these factors in some ways, play a role in these states to build up this consciousness. So it's not just one factor. It's not just economic development, or it's not just the land tenure system, but there is an entire set of factors that creates the sort of environment in these states for this kind of process, for this process of consciousness, of awareness to appear in Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra. And then again, we'll come to where Dalit politics stands today in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And I was sort of, when we do that, at that time, I'd want to sort of engage this question of, is there only one path to this kind of consciousness? But historically there is a reason for why post-independence these two states find themselves in a very different place as compared to the northern states.
So let me pose another large puzzle that I think is in the background of your book, and I'll put it a little bit simplistically just to kind of provoke an answer from you. So you document, and this is a kind of, at one level, a kind of obvious fact about India, that Dalits as a group have historically been the most marginalized, oppressed, humiliated. I mean, literally on every dimension of human oppression that you can think of. And in some senses, it's also the group that, not just historically, but even in contemporary India, for the most part, there are a few exceptions and changes, the formal structures of the state serve the least effectively in some ways, right? Untouchability is still practiced in parts of India. Yes, there has been great progress in Dalit education, but the gap still is significant. All of those measures, right, in some ways. Okay. So on the one hand, you have this empirical picture. On the other hand, you have this interesting sort of reality about Dalit politics that many social theorists have argued that as a group, Dalits have been the most powerful custodians, not just of the Indian constitutional project and Indian constitutionalism, but also the articulation of a certain kind of civility in politics, right? Which is that if you compare, for example, them to, let's say, a whole range of other groups and social movements, right? Propensity to take up violence, propensity to, in some senses, organize in disruptive ways. I mean, rail roko, rasta roko, all of that, right? There might be occasional exception here, Dalit Panthers, briefly in Maharashtra and stuff, right? And, from a distance to people, it looks like, what explains this paradox? Now, one could be that actually this paradox is just a product of their marginalization, that when you don't have any resources in some senses, your marginalization has been so total, right, that even those forms of collective action might not be available. But reading your book, it struck me that that can't be the whole story, right? That how does this group that is the most marginalized also actually end up becoming the custodian of Indian constitutionalism and civility in a way in which it is very hard to argue almost any other equivalent group in society, middle caste, upper caste, can actually lay credit to. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, Pratap, you're right. And in some ways, this is, and it's a fascinating question, because I think this question is not going to go away. As Dalit assertion in different forms continues to gain momentum, because it's not that assertion is not going away, and in some ways, you're right. There is a structural aspect to it, which is, if you sort of even think about in the Indian electoral system, for example, in a democratic system, the avenues for assertion, if they exist through political parties by choosing your representatives, the threshold for mobilization for that avenue is so high that, that social mobilization then is something that you just will turn to because it is an easier form. You can do it with fewer people, fewer resources. And so, there is a reason why we will see more of this kind of politics. But even there, that politics of mobilizing in the social space can become more disruptive, can become more violent. In some places it does. But there is an adherence to a certain norm. And I think there are two aspects to it. One, you do point to, which is that among a lot of the leaders, especially, there has been this ongoing conversation about civility, that we are, that the Constitution belongs to us, and therefore we must respect it. And I say it's a conversation because there has also been disagreements. If you go back to the Dalit Panthers,
yes, right.
Who wanted to be more assertive in Maharashtra, who wanted to, who said that their politics is distinct because it needed to be more assertive, because they were on the receiving end of violence, and that needed to be responded to. So it's an ongoing conversation. But even there, there was the other side trying to argue against that particular view. But I think, related to this is the other aspect, which is that this is a group that knows domination so viscerally, right? It is something that never leaves their life.
Yeah.
And once you've been on the receiving end of that, I think that shapes your ideas, your approaches. You realize what domination and violence does. And I think that's why I think the seed that's where the seed for this kind of thinking comes from. And I think it's deeply rooted now. And I think it'll always check the violent impulses, the disruptive impulses when they appear in the politics, because no one or very few other groups in India know or have been on the receiving end of dominance, in such a sustained way. And so there, the thinking among Dalits is different. And we need to think a little bit more carefully about how groups think about disruption and violence.
That's a really kind of profound observation. So let's kind of segue from that into actually the in a sense the kind of political argument. So you have this kind of debate, sort of construction about sort of tactics and so forth. And in a nutshell, and the one thing I have to say, I think to our viewers, I mean, just as a kind of footnote, because we are talking in summary form. Actually, one of the things Amit's book is very good about is also picking up the heterogeneity amongst Dalits. I mean, we've been using Dalits as a kind of single unified category, which in some senses it is. But Amit's book charts, I think, a wonderful course in actually how to think about Dalit identity and Dalit politics, both as a unified category and yet captured in some senses the heterogeneity within it. And we'll come to that in a second. But maybe one element of that heterogeneity, which is the question we started off with, Amit, which is, what is it that explains why a state like UP, a Dalit political party, in some senses, like the BSP, does electorally better than, let's say, the BSP does in other states or its kind of counterpart parties do? What are the factors that, in a sense, explain, right? The fact, and particularly because, as you said, in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, the social consciousness, the forms of social mobilization that were available to Dalits actually had much, in a sense, deeper roots. So what explains this paradox?
So what happens, and what I find is that, in where these movements or this kind of social mobilization is stronger across these states, where what happens is there are two kinds of things that begin to appear. Dalit demands their symbols, representations of their assertion, one representation. And the other representation, which is leaders at the local level, people who sort of embody, who transmit, who talk about the Dalit assertion. I mean, these are people who are already present in the public sphere at the local level. Yeah. And in that sense, there are two things that are happening. One, it begins to signal to multicast parties who want to mobilize Dalit voters. Mm-hmm. And in a competitive system, parties want to mobilize everyone. Mm-hmm. That, this is a group that you will have to mobilize on their terms. And here I just want to sort of take a step back and want to, just assert this, this one important point. Franchise, and this is the first sort of discovery when I was doing my work is, franchise doesn't necessarily mean mobilization. Yeah. You can go to vote without your demands being met, even being acknowledged and recognized. Right. And so this is not happening in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu because the social mobilization has put these things already in the electoral sphere. So parties, incorporate these ideas. They incorporate the demand for recognition. They bring in Dalit party workers. They recruit them. And so by the time these parties, Dalit parties, appear in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, they are not the only ones talking about Dalit assertion. They are not the only ones pushing for an anti-caste or social justice or self-respect based discourse. Party workers are already present in Dalit localities. Mm. In Uttar Pradesh and in Bihar, both, whether it's BSP or it's the other lower caste parties first and the Lok Janshakti party later, they find a very different landscape. Their landscape essentially, when they enter Dalit localities, they find that this kind of discourse is they are the first people to bring some of this discourse to the Dalit localities. There are very few localities in which, for example, I found that they were party representatives, party workers who were regularly recruited around the elections. Now, Dalits have been voting in these localities, but party workers were not there. Their connection with political parties was very different. These parties, the Congress especially, just did not have a Dalit face. BJP at this moment is rising in these states at that time. Go back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, and they don't have party workers in these localities. So the BSP in that sense is both in terms of their leadership, the kind of campaign slogans they have, the kind of assertion that they represent, and just in a very practical sense, their on the ground presence. They are the first ones to be recruiting people. So suddenly the party has a face, and so they are far more successful in these states and being able to mobilize Dalit voters. And look, ultimately the one requirement, the one first thing that any caste-based party needs to solve, one problem, is that they need the support of a significant part of the caste bloc. Yeah. And what I found, which was really interesting, is when I spoke to Dalit party workers in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, they kept complaining about unity. Yeah. They're like, we've got to be united to be able to assert ourselves, to bring, during elections. And then when you ask them, like, why doesn't the vote come behind you? It's like, then they start articulating these challenges that they face. That, for example, in Maharashtra, everybody talks about Ambedkar. Sab log neeli topi pehante hain, which is, the blue symbol of the Ambedkari movement. And the blue color is the Ambedkari color. And so, so this kind of, so this complaining and the lament about a lack of unity, that occurs because Dalits are already tied to different political parties. And really, there is nothing that new that Dalit parties are bringing to whether it's the large Dalit community among Mahars, who are politically influential, who are sizable, or it's the pariahs in Tamil Nadu, again, large and sizable. But when it comes to BSP going out to the Jatavs, it's a different story there. And similarly, when the LJP starts mobilizing the Dosats, it's a different story there. These parties are able to build or find an electoral bloc among these castes, among these jatis far more easily than is the case with Dalit parties in Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra.
So Amit, that raises two questions. One, so far we've kind of focused in a sense on the kind of demand side, the way in which social mobilization of Dalits then creates different kinds of incentives for parties to engage with them and the conditions under which they're successful. But can you also speak a little bit about this puzzle in North India, right? So you're the Congress party in the 1980s, right? You have historically relied on the Dalit vote. At least that's the conventional wisdom, right? You even actually had national level Dalit leaders. Jagjeevan Ram was a significant political force, right? Now, what do you think is going on in the Congress that just at the moment where Dalit political consciousness, partly as a result of Kanshi Ram's efforts, and the rudiments of a social movement in UP are beginning, as it were, to sort of flourish. What is it about the Congress that it kind of loses the plot in a state like UP, right? Because you would have thought it would be in their rational interest, even if there isn't Dalit social mobilization, even if there isn't their long history of, social reform and the creation of a new identity, it would be in the rational interest of this political party to actually reach out and incorporate. What happened there? Arguably Congress is still recovering from that kind of blunder. What's that part of the story?
No, and it really is. It was again one of those things which really puzzled me during the field work, because what is really interesting is Congress is two different creatures in two different states. The same Congress, which loses Dalit votes and which relies on Dalit votes for its political survival in Uttar Pradesh in such a significant way, is a very different creature in Maharashtra. And so it's not like that there wasn't a model within the party or an experience of the party that they could not learn from, because the same party is actually far more attentive to social justice conversations. It's a part of their campaign. They have Dalit, they recruit Dalit party workers on the ground in much larger numbers in Maharashtra. That's not the case in Uttar Pradesh, and that's why the Dalit vote just leaves. And the one reason it does is because the same party over a long period of time just hasn't built the same connection with Dalits in Uttar Pradesh. They have not used the social justice discourse. They have not embraced, as you absolutely you're absolutely correct. What they do is, once they see Dalit assertion, they co-opt it by just, bringing these leaders, and I'm thinking about BP Maurya, for example, who's the RPI is broken and then just brought in to the Congress. Yeah. That's the formula that they use. But they never actually get into engaging the community by incorporating their symbols, as I said, by talking about social justice, by recruiting at the ground level. So the party, frankly, does not have a face in Dalit localities in these states. And so when the BSP appears, it just is so unique. It is so different. And the same BSP just is not as unique in Maharashtra when it starts campaigning there. It's not able to take away the Dalit votes in the same way. And even as the party crashes, and the party does have it has its internal issues at this time. It loses its leaders. Both Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi die in quick succession, and the party is really unstable because it's losing votes elsewhere. And in that moment, it ends up paying for this folly of its merit of not building deep roots. In a competitive system, it just begins to lose votes, Dalit votes.
Okay. Thanks, Amit. So let me pick on another thing you said. I mean, about this whole question of kind of Dalit unity and the way that constantly came up in your conversations in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu and other states. And maybe ask that question in a slightly, again, larger historical frame. So again, for the purposes of simplification, one narrative of Indian politics over the last 20, 30 years is historically there have been jatis.
Right.
And partly because of the nature of our constitutional discourse, partly because of affirmative action, reservation, job services, partly because of genuine social reform movements, all the kinds of mobilizations that you talk about. The character of Dalit politics was moving towards more agglomeration, right? Which is, how do you, in a sense, take the jatis and construct a more effective, unified political identity out of them? How that identity is exercised can be debated, but the logic was a logic of a certain kind of social agglomeration. First, even the kind of, the invention of the category Dalit as a kind of marker of social consciousness, and that entire repertoire that you write about so powerfully and beautifully of symbols, in a sense, even how to tell that history, as it were, of oppression, and all of that, right? And that's the agglomeration that in the North produces something like the BSP, albeit late. But in states like Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, that social agglomeration remains quite powerful, even though, as you point out, it has the option of voting for different parties and it gets incorporated into different political parties. Now, some people are beginning to argue that we are at this very critical phase in Dalit politics where that logic of social agglomeration is actually now coming under stress. In fact, to put it slightly melodramatically, it might even be reversed. Partly because the internal differentiation between various Dalit subcastes that, let's say, the BSP had brought together, right? The Jatovs and Chamars in North, India. That internal differentiation is becoming a little bit more pronounced. Partly, if you look at instruments of state policy, right, this new form of social engineering that the state wants to do, EBCs, reservation within reservation, the entire kind of subcategorization story, right? Partly the gulf between the very small Dalit middle class that you have and, and the kind of the bulk of Dalit voters, that all of these changes are bringing Dalit politics to a point where, despite the fact that there is this common history of oppression and marginalization, the political logic now is actually ripe for a more de-agglomerated form of Dalit politics. And that's actually the space the BJP has been fishing in some ways, right? Do you kind of buy this narrative of de-agglomeration, or how do you sort of think of this in the long arc of Dalit identity?
So I think the de-agglomeration is happening, and you're right. The BJP and other parties are both fishing in it, as well as are very much involved in creating this kind of phenomenon. But I think this is a lot of it is still an electoral phenomenon, right? These are because if you sort of think about and there the kind of electoral space we are in has shifted as the BJP has emerged, and as in its ascension, it's sort of managed to become a party, especially in North India. When you start gathering about 40% of the vote share in certain states, then you are a dominant player, or you're heading towards some kind of an electoral dominance. And once you have that, then it becomes easier for the party to sort of start enabling this kind of breakaway of small groups based on different grievances, because these are real grievances. You are absolutely right. Even within the same jatis, for example, the big jatis, there is class differentiation. There is differentiation among smaller and larger Dalit jatis. So those issues are there. But at the same time, if you think about all the things that could potentially divide the group, there are still enough reasons that can potentially unite them. And we see some degree of that unity in the conversations outside the electoral sphere, right? So, if you see the conversation that around Dalit politics, around Dalit assertion, whether it's across university students, if you go on to social media, for example, if you look at the YouTube channels, and I'm just, again, this is a small segment, without a doubt. You could argue this is also the elite segment. That would also be correct. But the fact is today, there are national conversations of the type we've not seen in the past. We've always said that, look, caste is local. It does not go beyond state boundaries. In fact, even going as widely as a state sometimes is difficult. And yet we're seeing new kinds of conversations today that we've not seen in the past. And I'll give you another example. Just completed a small study on Dalit protest activity with my graduate student Rajkamal Singh. And what we find is so interesting in that we looked at the things that bring Dalit protesters out on, and because we're looking at the Jantar Mantar protests. What we find there is really interesting, that Dalits are still protesting today when we look at their demands about the things that they've always been protesting about. Better implementation of reservation policies, protesting against Dalit atrocities which are committed against Dalits, their oppression. I mean, these demands have always been there. If the world had changed so much, then, we should have seen newer kind of demands appear. But the predominant protest demands are still the same, which sort of tells us that a lot of those issues are still around. You need the institutional space, and you need the political genius in that sense to be able to mobilize it, and maybe that will appear.
So one of the things, again, the book is very powerful, and again, this is a kind of very chastening story for India, which is, as you rightly said, how much of the conversation actually traces its roots to what people were talking about 40, 50 years ago. And I think it's an indictment of Indian democracy at one level, that we still need to be talking about caste atrocities, the treatment of Dalit by institutions of law and order. And it is, you can't put too fine a point on it. It is still in some senses very stark and brutal oppression. It's right. But let me sort of look at it from a kind of different direction in some ways. Again, the political side of it, right? So this was a question somebody asked me, and I honestly did not have the answer, so I'm asking you. The Bhima Koregaon agitations took place in Maharashtra. And as you know, one of the outcomes of that agitation has been that activists in that agitation have been targeted by the Indian state. Not just kind of prominent intellectuals in some ways. And, there's this attempt to portray Bhima Koregaon as part of this global conspiracy. And frankly, we are now reaching new dimensions in how the state might target activists, if some of the reports are to be believed. The question that we've asked me is that, look, here is a pivotal moment in Maharashtra politics, at least in both mobilizational terms, and something that also has political significance. Here is a very visible way in which the state comes after, right? Some of the most high profile, admittedly they are elite activists, but they are high profile activists. And yet you don't get pushback from Dalit political parties or Dalit political groups, right? Again, is that correct? Is that characterization correct? And if so, what might actually explain this, that the simultaneous deepening of political consciousness and constancy of social consciousness, and yet at a kind of high visibility moment, political challenge, relatively little kind of organized political discussion around it?
So, Pratap, I'm not so sure that we don't see discussions about it, right? I mean, because if you look at a lot of what is discussed among Dalits, a lot of what is part of everyday conversation in the community, that actually very rarely makes it to mainstream press. But this particular issue is very big in Maharashtra. It's very widely talked about. It's discussed. It is seen as an act of oppression against the community, because because of just how much the commemoration at this spot matters. And this is not new. This has been there for a long time. So it's, and now when it comes to the arrest of leaders around this, again, this is something there's a conversation around this. Yeah. But if we are looking for mass protests against it, or violence against it, I mean, this is where the structural difference shows up. Yeah. When the state comes after this group, yeah, more often than not, you will see that the protests will disappear, and we've seen this time and again. Mm-hmm. As far as if they were if these were leaders who were, let's say, genuinely in some ways leaders of militant groups and I'm talking about even street-based militant groups, right? You would have seen that in some ways, that sort of tells us that a lot of these folks are, generally, these are intellectual leaders, right? These are not so many of them, so in that sense, without a doubt, this signaling that's gone out has mattered. It has sent a signal to the community that, there are consequences for going up against the state on this issue. Because these were also, remember why these people were brought in. They were brought in the name of national security.
That's right.
So there's a clear signaling there, and at the same time, but if you sort of think that this matter has disappeared and it's not talked about, that's not the case.
No, I actually agree. Yeah. I mean, I think it's more. I think what people have more in mind, I think, is the visible political protest.
Because Pratap, this is the one thing which I sort of make a point of in the book, is when you think about Dalit social mobilization, or for that matter of most marginalized groups, see, these are not groups who are organized in a formal way with registered members, with sort of serious organizational capacity, which in that sense, right? So a lot of this capacity is very diffused. It's very decentralized. It's very local, and a lot of the mobilization happens within the family, within the locality, within the neighborhood, and that is why I even study it at that level, because I actually went. Yeah. That was my hubris in the beginning. Yeah. I went looking for those organizations, and they're not there. But if you go and look at or they're not in those numbers as you would expect, for other groups. But the moment you look at the locality level, at the family level, it's widespread.
No, actually, that's the part of your book I wanted to kind of bring out by using Bhima Kodega as a provocation. And actually, I'm glad you went into that, because I think your book, provides a sort of, again, a fascinating sociology of the nature of the kind of organizational support for this kind of social mobilization. So again, let me ask you a kind of big question that's on a lot of people's minds, given your analysis of Dalit politics and social mobilization. The million-dollar question on everybody's minds these days is, what is going to be the relationship between Dalit politics and Hindutva in, the coming few years? At two levels. One, of course, at the political level, which you've already touched upon in a state like UP, in some senses, the kinds of political opportunities that the BJP has seen. In another state, which is going to elections, West Bengal, where, frankly, the story looks a little bit parallel to the Congress's story in UP, where both the left and the TMC historically did not create the kind of depth and thickness of Dalit presence, right, within, as it were, the leadership structure ranks, which they might now pay the price for. I mean, there's no question that, the BJP has made inroads into Dalit politics in Bengal. So there is politics at that level, right, and in Bihar as well. But then there's also the larger ideological question, which is given, of course, at the elite level, you always have this argument that there was a fundamental incompatibility between Ambedkarism and Hinduism, or that form of ideological discourse that said, look, the only way in which caste emancipation is possible is, in a sense, not just emancipation from Hinduism, but at one level, a weakening or a diminution of Hinduism, right? So that's at one end of the ideological spectrum. And certainly, I think in university circles, that argument is actually quite, popular in some ways, right? And yet you have the political reality, I think, of the BJP being more successful at incorporating Dalits into its electoral game plan, and arguably, I think, even more deeply. I mean, frankly, it's hard to argue that the BJP is more casteist than the Congress was. Quite the reverse, actually. Yeah. So how do you see both the ideological and the political relationship? How should one think about it? I mean, it's hard to predict the future, but how should analytically one think about this relationship?
I think absolutely. This is a completely fascinating question, because I think 2014 was an inflection point, and a lot of people will sort of say it was an inflection point because the BJP was so successful and it sees the emergence of Narendra Modi as a national leader, and all those things are correct. There's another aspect of the inflection point here is that, if you go back to BJP 2004, 2009, for example, you look at the Dalit vote share, right? It's sitting at about 10%, just holding steady, right? And then suddenly it jumps to 25%, where it stands at about 34%. In places like, and if you are thinking about North Indian states, large North Indian states, when you are pulling so many Dalits, towards yourself, and then the question arises: how did this happen? And there is something different, without a doubt, about the current BJP. It is different. Narendra Modi's BJP is different from Lal Krishna Advani's BJP, because there has been a clear outreach to Dalits and to other lower caste groups. And what is, I think, and that's, it's partly that there is greater awareness of building a larger social coalition to ensure that the party's hold on electoral politics continues to grow. So there is definite design there. There are also enabling conditions, which is that the BJP is benefiting from the kind of mobilization that BSP and LJP have already done in these states. Once you have Dalit localities who have had party workers, where there is a degree of autonomous assertion, then that's the way you will have to mobilize Dalit. So in some ways, today BJP actually has Dalit party workers in Dalit localities, which was not the case in the past. So its outreach, both in terms of incorporating their symbols and in recruiting party workers, is very different from what the BJP had done in the previous phases of mobilization. And so there is a clear difference. Now, mobilizing Dalits by appealing to causes of social justice, by talking about Ambedkar, and benefiting from that familiarity with Ambedkar and social justice discourse, which was brought to these localities and neighborhoods by Dalit parties. That's one aspect of it. But, have we turned, is the BJP now turning them into a sort of reliable, durable Hindutva voter? I'm not so sure about that. And simply because there are two reasons, and my reasons are not of the ideological variety, and I'll come to the ideological issue also. But I think it's just that there are still very serious contradictions on the ground when it comes to Dalit incorporation. And, and BJP in that sense, as it tries to build this big tent and have both the Thakurs as well as the Dalits sitting side by side, it'll have to figure out how to manage this. Because yes, in principle, they're supposed to be sitting next to each other, but in practice on the ground, that's not the case. There is a lot of pent up animosity, for example, in some of the northern states about the phase, the phase during which both SP and PSP, for example, have been in power, and where the feeling was that the upper caste were left out. So some of that anger is very much there. And yeah, I mean, if you go to rural UP, go to rural Bihar, rural Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, we don't have social equality. So there are these contradictions that are there. And again, there is an art to managing them. It's not that it's not possible, but how do you manage them? And especially how do you manage them? And in terms of the people who the party recruits, that remains to be seen. Yeah. Now, let me come to the ideological point. And I think that is a really, really interesting point, because I think the adherence to Ambedkari ideology, thinking about Ambedkar, thinking about that discourse has not gone away. Yeah. That conversation is alive and well among Dalits. It's not always public facing. And when it is, the public doesn't always observe it. Yeah. But it's very much there. Yeah. And what is interesting is, if you go look at Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, there's also a lesson there. See, a lot of the Dalits' assertion there, where the movements were so different, was they actually attacked the caste system. Yeah. And therefore it was a real challenge, a reformist challenge to Hinduism. There was the issue, the caste problem had to be contended with. Now, it may not, there was no, one can't come out and say that, look, all of these issues have gone away. Not at all. But this issue was established and the politics was framed, in the light of social justice very differently than has been the case in the North. In the North, caste assertion, especially lower caste assertion, including Dalit assertion, has been about capturing political power, right? So we haven't seen that kind of challenge to the idea of hierarchy in the North. And the BJP benefits from that. Its terrain, in that sense, electorally speaking, is different in the South. And that's something that we need to remember when we think about the ideological differences. But again, as I said, yes, we may say that ideological conversations are elitist, but even in the moment when the BJP is ascendant, those ideological conversations among Dalits at least have not gone away.
Yeah, and I mean, those are two very important ones, both the continuing difference between North and South. And also, I mean, I think part of the intent of the question was to exactly bring to attention the fact that what we think of as ideological conversation, happens at different levels in different ways. I think Mr. Gandhi's signaling for us that we can probably open.
No, I am not.
Please for some questions.
Please continue. We'll come
so I just wanted to ask Amit one last question before we open it up to the audience. And Amit, this is both more a kind of personal question, but about your research, but also a question about the argument. So one of the most, I think, searing chapters in the book is the last chapter before the conclusion, which is in a sense on the identity trap. Right. Yeah. That despite social mobilization, despite political success, despite all the instruments of social welfare that the Indian state has varyingly implemented, the sense of being trapped in this identity is very deep and profound and powerful. And not because anybody wants to be trapped in it, but because the structural and external conditions still do not allow escape. And one of the things your book very powerfully points out is that the standard easy tropes we had in our kind of, modernizing kind of story urbanization caste will disappear, education caste will disappear. Of course, those are enabling conditions. Those will help at some point, but clearly they are, right? So when you look at this longer trajectory, as it were, right, and of the way in which this community has been trapped in this identity, what do you think India needs to do differently? I mean, apart from kind of first living up to our own promises, I mean, there's a certain kind of easy hypocrisy that comes to us. There's a certain kind of laziness that comes to us in thinking about this. But, if you had to think of one or two things that you wish, it could be political things, it could be social things, do differently, what would you draw our attention to?
At least a 2,000-year-old system.
Right.
if I had the answer for some of its pernicious effects to go away, I can talk about it, but it would be whether these things are workable or not, or how impactful they are. That I would not hazard a guess on that. But I will say this, that I think you're right. This is the durability of the stigma around identity. Is something that I sort of return to at the end, because ultimately the point is fine whether it's you can if democracy allows the space for electoral assertion, it allows you to find a political voice. If economic opportunities allow that dependence to disappear, and there's research that finds that it's beginning to disappear even in rural India, even in rural Uttar Pradesh, and then what does this autonomy, what does this kind of assertion bring? And even among those who are well off, who are well educated, urbanized, all the things we think are required or prerequisites for a casteless, quote unquote, society. And I sort of, when we checked for that, using the study on the marriage market, that those things don't go away. The power of that stigma stays. And in some ways, I think somewhere we've got to figure this out in terms of when we think about caste and caste differentiations, jatis and jati differentiations, is how does this stigma reproduce itself? Because caste and its stigma is getting, in some ways they're both getting reproduced through the marriage market, and that's one reason we sort of looked at it. Both, and I did this work with Susan Osterman, who's at University of Notre Dame. Where essentially, so in some ways we need to sort of think about the social spaces, the private spaces, not so much in terms of regulating them, but more in terms of influencing them, and what mechanisms could be used to influence them, so that somehow the stigma associated with identity can go away. Maybe identity differentiation may not go away that swiftly, but the fact is, if the reason that the stigma is getting perpetuated, despite all the conditions that we expect that should attack it, is because somewhere we are still not coming to terms with what, how hierarchy works, how hierarchy damages society, and how there is a stake for everyone, not just who are the marginalized, but even those who are supposedly in the dominant or privileged groups. We have a combined stake in the dismantling of this hierarchy. And until there is consciousness of that there are gains for everybody here, we are going to be locked in this contest, or where even when we start getting groups who have not had a voice acquire a voice and they assert themselves, somehow reasons would be found for that stigma to be kept alive. And so that's where I think we need to sort of think more carefully about how do we design, whether it's our education system, whether it's what we teach. And so again, I'm not thinking about state regulation of people's personal private lives, but I am definitely suggesting that we need to have a conversation about our personal spaces, about how hierarchy is everywhere in our lives and how it manifests itself, and also how it is not just damaging towards those who are on the receiving end, because they don't always come from the marginalized group. A lot of them also come from the dominant privileged groups. So we all have a stake in the removal of these kind of relations.
No, this is a book with a deep ethical impulse. And I think one of the things it also does very powerfully is actually remind us that, fundamentally, this is an ethical question. We can talk about the politics, the sociology, the history, and the economics. But what our own ethical commitments have been to dismantling this absolutely atrocious system of hierarchy and stigma. I think the book really sort of, asks some very hard questions about that. So we'll open it up to questions. I think Ajay ji and Vikram ji.
Thank you. Thank you, Pratap and Amit, for this wonderful conversation. And I strongly believe that when two professors of your caliber talk to each other, we have some 20 PhD topics ready. And really, you've had a very intense and deep conversation on many issues concerning this. I have a few questions, but the questions are just flowing down. And I would just like to ask Amit, the first question I would have is that this marginalization of communities in India, of course, we are talking about the Dalit movement, but has it been the international experience that any community which is as large as what the Dalits are in India been continuously marginalized, maybe the blacks in the US or somewhere? How do those democracies function?
I think that's a really, really interesting question, because yes, large communities, the Dalits are the largest in that sense. But, if you think about post-apartheid or even during the apartheid, South Africa, if you think about the African-American community in the United States, you think about Roma, who are a smaller community, even the Borakman or a smaller community. So, so there are these struggles in democracies are ongoing. And when you have this kind of very distinct historical marginalization, where groups have been, where the disadvantage has accumulated over a long period of time. And, there is not just economic disadvantage, but also political exclusion and as well as social exclusion. Then it becomes a real challenge for democracies to deal with it. And again, at least in democracies, at least when you have those kind of freedoms, it at least starts. You get the process of coming to terms with these kind of historical disadvantages. Take away those democratic freedoms. Take away political competition, for example. Take away the legislation that provides protection. Take away a judiciary that protects the rights which are guaranteed in constitutions. Then you start seeing that these disadvantages are in some ways, again, they're just historically, that challenge disappears. That process of coming to terms with it disappears. And again, even where these processes are alive and well, you can look at the United States, for example, today. These are very difficult conversations. You have 2 steps forward, you have a step backwards. But there is, and I sort of want to so there is a serious value And you can sort of say there is an ethical reason, as Pratap's pointed out, and that is absolutely correct, in asking ourselves what kind of society do we want to live in, and that is and democracies ask such questions. When you guarantee freedoms, you are forced to come to terms with these kind of questions. But there is also beyond that, beyond just an ethical reason, there is a serious self-interest, as I said, of everyone to make sure that these questions in such spaces where there has been historical disadvantage, we come to terms with them for simple reason that if we don't, there are serious governance implications. There are divisions which will continue. There are, as economists would tell us, inefficiencies that will continue. If you select out an entire section or segment of a population by declaring them as unqualified or stigmatized, then you are just losing access to a pool of talent. Does a society want to do that to itself? So there are very good reasons, not just ethical reasons, but also reasons rooted in self-interest that that force democracies or should force democracies to come to terms with these kind of historical disadvantages.
This is more a question to Pratap, because he used the word indictment of democracy as to what happened to the Dalits in the last 50 years. But you ended up saying that the question should be a more an ethical question. Maybe you should have said that it should be an indictment of our society itself, not so much of democracy. I can see Gandhi tried to do something to a reformist movement and separating the politics and the reforms process. Ambedkar attempted to do a religious side entry by doing Buddhism as a vehicle to demarginalize them. Do you think that that is what is missing in the whole piece, that we don't have a reformist attitude towards this?
No, I completely agree with you. I think sort of you're right. It sort of gets back to what Pratap was saying in some ways, which is if you sort of think about, where should we go from here? I think what both Ambedkar and Gandhi and others, have tried to do over a period of time is to come to terms with this notion of hierarchy. And so that is sort of so deeply rooted in the practice of Hinduism. And in some ways, in fact, not only that, it's actually, if you look at Indian Christianity, Indian Sikhism, Islam in India, they've all got the hierarchy bugged down. So it's all pervasive in that sense. But you're right that essentially, there is a conversation to be had parallel to politics, and conversation which will invariably enter politics about hierarchy, and about our social relations, because these social relations organize our lives at home, they organize our life at work, at school, in the street, in public spaces. Some of those problems that we've known of untouchability, of temple entry, those have diminished, have not gone away entirely. But the attitudes that went with it are still around. And there are new forms of separations and that we've discovered, in our lives. So I think conversation around that and powerful conversations around that are required at all times. And you're absolutely right. So that reformist tendencies, Gandhi and Ambedkar had different views about it, and we can go into that. But the fact is, they were both addressing this issue pretty directly, and I think that engagement with this issue needs to continue. It cannot be just confined to electoral campaigns.
Would you want to add to that, Pratap?
No, so just one quick thought. I'm actually also glancing at the questions, and I think this question has also come up in different forms.
Yes.
Amit, so I think two things. One, I think Amit is absolutely right, which is, in fact, okay, let me pose this as a question to Amit, just to kind of deepen. So Amit, there's one view that says that, look, you're absolutely right. We need that social reform, and not just at an ideological level. I mean, it requires a certain kind of organizational imagination as well. And that's something, again, both Gandhi and Ambedkar got us to thinking about in some senses, right? And in fact, the only organization that seems to have an organizational imagination of that kind these days is actually the RSS, which has been playing a very, very long-term game of cultural transformation. What would the equivalent, as it were, that tried to abolish caste look like, right? Yeah. But the question I wanted to ask you is that, there is a point of view out there that says, look, that it's precisely because India was good at political incorporation, right? We had free elections. There is at least nominally more distribution of political power, and we can use the instrument of state for doing the kinds of things that, would allow for this. That it is precisely because we have been slightly better at political incorporation that the question of social reform went off the agenda, right? That, and you have upper caste saying, look, we've done reservation, what else do you need, right? There is this distribution of power happening. We will do a little bit more of it, end of story, right? Our entire energies are invested, in a sense, in that political sharing of power, rather than the kind of the underlying social hierarchy. So the mischievous question I want to ask you is, to what extent is political democracy actually a distraction from the core question to make the question even stronger?
Yeah. No, I think you're you're right. And I see the point in that question, because you're right that, one could argue, and that's the case, that we provided for these measures, through the Constitution and through legislation later on. And, that shows our commitment towards dealing with hierarchy. And that would be correct if you just looked at our experience. But if you sort of look around the world and then come back to our own experience and even ask some tougher questions about our experience. I'll give you one very simple example from my own personal life. For example, I was educated in India. I went through schooling, through my university education, and I got a degree in economics. And I can't think of a single paper in economics when I went through that course for 3 years at Delhi University at that time that dealt with the caste problem.
Yeah.
It just wasn't there in our curriculum. We were not taught about caste discrimination, what it does, how does it manifest itself, what its long-term effects are. And so, you had an entire generation, in fact, you had generations here who've been told that there is a reservation system out there and that, certain number of seats in universities and government jobs are kept aside for certain groups. But it's never explained as to why this reservation system was put into place. What the historical disadvantage here is, what is it about, how does it still survive? And in that sense, and there was nothing stopping us in a democratic country, in a democratic system, from instituting those things. So having that conversation alive outside these institutional measures, outside just the electoral campaigns and the kind of issues they bring up, talking about them in between elections, I think that would do a great service to our democracy in that sense. Because I agree that yes, I would not. I'm not so sure if I want to sort of say that we should indict our democratic politics, because in some ways its inefficiencies and its problems aside, it has created that space for political assertion, and there's a real value to that. No two ways about it. But we would as a society go so much further, because ultimately political systems are not an end in themselves. We put them in place with certain objectives, certain goals in mind, whether these are goals about conflict management, about governance, about a better life, so both normatively as well as, in terms of real objectives that we want to meet in terms of our standards that we aspire to. The political system is there in some place, but it needs these other conversations happening in parallel for those promises of democracy to be realized, especially when it comes to conversations about marginalized groups.
That was a very fascinating statement you made, and very, very important one, Amit. Before I go on with other questions, I just want to tell everyone that this conversation is in partnership with the New India Foundation, which has helped to put this together. I should have mentioned it in the beginning, but it just missed my mind. And this is a fascinating book of Amit that we have discussed today. You may all go to the link that is given in the video description on Amazon and buy the book. It's absolutely first rate and highly recommended.
Thank you.
So, Amit, the question that has come in multiple ways from 2-3 different people in the audience is this. How does BJP, which is considered an upper caste party, able to capture a good amount of Dalit votes? What is RSS's relationship and view of the Dalits? And how does this arithmetic work out?
So I think the arithmetic is pretty clear in the sense that this is a BJP that is far more attentive to building a large social coalition and, under its electoral banner to be able to capture power. It's, this is, there is a clear realization in the party that, that they were seen as an upper caste party. If you look at just their sort of top echelons of the party, you may still find a fair number or the upper caste being overrepresented. But, the party has definitely, without a doubt, as I mentioned, moved when it comes to the way it mobilizes voters and the way it recruits party workers and the way it actually acknowledges issues of social justice. This is a different party today. And so if you want to, I think it'll be, therefore, we need to go back and revisit some of the categorization that we use for the BJP and alter them a little bit to match the realities that we see on the ground. And so the party has, taken major steps in trying to incorporate new groups. And the fact that they've been able to draw people from among the lower caste in much larger numbers, that reflects in their electoral performance. As I mentioned, even among Dalits, their vote share used to be at 10%. It's now sitting at about 34%. And that's a big leap. And it's not just that, Dalits are moving towards the party because they are drawn to Mr. Modi. A large number of them may very well be. That is, that's true for people from all caste groups. So there is no doubt that Mr. Modi's personal appeal has a role to play here. But what also has a role to play, and it's so significantly visible in terms of the difference between the party in the 2004-2009 election on one hand and in the 2014 and 19 elections on the other hand, is how attentive they have been to incorporating Dalit symbols. They've done that with local symbols. They've done that with Ambedkar, who is a pan-Indian symbol, and not only incorporating him in terms of his images, but also aspects of his life, issues and some of the social justice conversations. Again, there is an ideological tension, and the BJP avoids that ideological tension. They don't incorporate Ambedkar in the way Ambedkar would have liked to be incorporated. And in fact, if Baba Saheb Ambedkar was alive today, I think he would have serious objections to how he is being used by the BJP. But that's a separate matter. But the fact is that there are more Dalit party workers in the BJP today. There are and the BJP is very vocally out there, talking about issues related to Dalits, something it has not done in the past, and that matters to why BJP is today a very different party from what it was in the past. I think the question that we also need to ask is, what does actually mean for Dalits? And there again, something that I want to sort of just touch upon that a little bit is that in my own research, I found that when the Dalit vote is completely behind one party, that doesn't necessarily mean that is advantageous for Dalits, because when that party is not in power, Dalits just don't have any access to the state. The other thing is that that same party can take you for granted if different parties are not competing for that vote. And so in some ways, if the outreach of BJP to Dalits actually increases competition for Dalit votes, it may not be a disadvantageous fact for Dalits. It may actually end up benefiting them. But if all the Dalit vote shifts, or if BJP ends up becoming the single dominant party, that will hurt them. So competition in that sense benefits Dalits a lot. And as long as BJP contributes to electoral competition for Dalit votes, that may actually be beneficial for them.
There's a question here. Actually, this question is coming in three different parts, but I think Shanta Sinha has summarized it. Why is the Indian elite so oblivious to Dalit rights?
And I will add to that a question that I have received, that why is it after 70 years, Dalits still remain the discriminated section of the society, and what actually has gone wrong in post-independence?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that's a question that we should ask ourselves in terms of what happened here, in terms of why are we so oblivious to the cause of Dalit emancipation, and the cause of in some ways getting rid of the kind of hierarchical relations we've had, and to sort of say that we've not made any that there has been no forward movement on this, that would not be correct, because sure, there are limitations to how far legislation has gone, how far different constitutional protections have gone. There are has everything worked as it should have? Not really. But we can't say that it hasn't worked at all. Both in terms of economic progress, as well as the institutional infrastructure that we put in place, they've had benefits for Dalits, and they've in some ways moved us in the right direction, if you want to call it that. But at the same time, I think what is really what has been missing has been this conversation in our institutions, in our organizations, in our schools, in our colleges, in our education system, about, as I mentioned in the past, about historical disadvantage, about stigma, about what it means, what does it mean to be stigmatized, how it impacts our life, and also why we all have a stake in getting rid of this problem. This is not, as long as Dalit emancipation, or for that matter, removal of these kind of social inequalities, of discrimination, remains a Dalit problem, quote unquote, if you want to sort of just see it like that, then I think, we are always going to be lagging behind in addressing it. This is not just a Dalit problem. This is our problem. This is everyone's problem, because, as long as these manifestations of hierarchy persist, we all lose out. We lose out as a collective, as a society, as a nation. And, until we have that kind of realization, I think, we will continue to have these questions as to why are the elites oblivious to the discrimination that Dalits face.
But then you said in the conversation that this discrimination across the country is what unites its identity. And there is a lot of push for unity amongst the Dalits. But then we are also talking about Dalits wanting to be mainstream. And if they want to be mainstream, they don't have to be united in that sense. Because if they form part of in some way, over a period of time, if they form part of the majority, then they don't have to stay united in that sense. So by pushing for unity, are we actually further marginalizing them?
I see what you're saying. And I see what you're saying, that essentially, I think if I would sort of rephrase that question, which is sort of things like, is the construction of a distinct Dalit identity, and if it goes beyond just the locality, it goes at the state level and beyond at the national level, is that in some ways consolidating the differences? And whereas, what we're looking for is assimilation. And there is a point to that. I completely see the idea here. But, it brings me back to Gopal Guru's that remarkable observation, which is that for Dalits, what choice do they have? To mobilize against caste, they've had to mobilize on the basis of caste. How else do they mobilize? How else do they put their demands out there? The reason they talk to each other across states today is because they share this experience of discrimination. They share this experience of exclusion. So yes, they would very much, I think there is the demand for inclusion is front and center. The idea of social justice is about belonging, right? But at the same time, how else do you make this demand? And so that conundrum is there.
Can I just say one word on this question, Vikramji, with your permission? I would actually reverse the question, because I think one of the things Amit is very good at is I think paying attention to language. Suppose we said Dalits are already mainstream in a normative sense, which is to say what they are giving their allegiance to is the core constitutional values that are supposed to be India's mainstream values, right?
Yes.
It is actually the rest of society that has to catch up with mainstreaming. The second thing, in a sense, you can say is that, look, in some ways, it is actually exclusion that is still, unfortunately, too much mainstream. And you get rid of that, and the mainstreaming problem, in a sense, solves itself. Because I actually do think that this kind of mainstreaming identity thing itself has become, almost a subtle. And I'll just give you an example from academic circles where, I was recently reading M.N. Srinivas, the great sociologist, and, absolutely fabulous at one level. But, when you now look in retrospect at this idea of Sanskritization and Westernization, here are two paths of sort of mainstreaming and assimilating, right? You actually realize how much of an exclusionary construct they themselves were, because no Dalit is saying we want to be excluded. No Dalit is saying we don't want the constitutional values. Right. The onus is in some senses outside of it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really beautifully put, and a very characteristic sort of Pratap way. It's so, I mean, I don't even know what can I add to that. It's just, but you're absolutely right that I think, if we are truly committed to the idea of mainstreaming, then that's the way to look at it. Because if you look at their demands, because that's where they are, that's where those demands are, and Pratap, there is exclusion. I mean, I'm sure it's we both sort of realize here are you and I having this conversation, right? Both upper castes, right? And in sort of in some ways it would be these are conversations which need to be had across not just the academic world, but in India, but across all kinds of organizations at home, and more often than we see them. So much of our public sphere today has shifted to social media, and then look at those social media groups and how deeply exclusionary some of those are, and those conversations are, and in some ways, this is a conversation that just needs to be, as you said, we need to sort of realize that it's exclusion in our country that is actually mainstream, and we need to sort of go after that.
This, I work on budgets regularly, and there's a number I want to mention here, that in the budget documents, they say the total amount of expenditure on scheduled caste schemes at a central level is nearly about 5% of the total expenditure of the central government. And it's about 125,000 crores, sort of some 25 lakh crores of expenditure. I'm just seeing it in the context of, if there is enough pressure, should this expenditure go up, or are we already doing it in hundreds of different dispersed schemes that actually this expenditure is not of any use to anyone? There are at least about, say, 90 to 100 schemes in which they are being spent across the country. And this is at a central level. I have not done a work on the state level. 5% of our expenditure is being done. So if you don't have a direction, and if there is not enough political demand in Parliament on how this expenditure has to be done, I think it's time that we discuss even this, not just making a statement of how much we are spending on that. Am I right?
So I think you're right in a sense that it's expenditure which is there, and some of this, if you go on see on the ground, this expenditure is even visible. It's not, it would be incorrect to say that none of this expenditure actually shows up on the ground. But at the same time, a lot of these schemes, the way they are designed, the way they are implemented, in terms of oversight, in terms of participation of people on the ground who are recipients, we're talking about a group that is disproportionately poor, that is not as well connected to the state. And that's where we start losing the plot a little bit in terms of both design as well as implementation. We just don't have that kind of feedback into the policy making process, where we use finite, limited resources in the most effective way. And when we use these resources, when we develop these programs, the people who are supposed to be impacted by these programs actually have a little more say in how these programs are being implemented. Because when because we know this, that with disadvantaged groups, whether it's Dalits or poor from that matter from any other group, there are serious oversight issues. It's the issue of how this money is being spent, where these programs are coming from, and what is the direct benefit they're supposed to get from these programs. And challenging the state authority is not easy when you're not connected to the state. So these problems are there, and some of these problems, I have to also say, are actually solved when you get more party workers in localities, because they then make it their business to find out, what kind of schemes, programs are there. That awareness begins to spread when you have a deeper recruitment among political parties, among these marginalized groups. So there is also a connection there.
I must say that completely agree with you that during our schooling and college education and even professional education, nowhere was there a single conversation about Dalits and the Dalit problem at all.
So
I think that is, I'm fairly certain that is true with my children also. They have not studied. What they have learned is like us from outside, the curricula.
No, here I would like to differ, Ajay. That's not true of me. It was part of our growing up that we worked with Dalits and we understood what they said, both in school and outside life. So it's not a uniform experience across the country.
Anyway, before we close, would Dr. Mehta want to say something?
No, I just wanted to congratulate Amit on winning the prize, which has brought us together. And the one thing I can say, if you'll allow me to, is that I know some of the exciting research Amit is doing right now, which probes into even deeper and actually, frankly, harder to study questions about the nature of exclusion in Indian society. And I very much look forward to learning about that in maybe a year's time or so. From what I've heard of Amit about that work, it's going to be even better than the brilliant stuff we already have in front of us.
That would be wonderful. Then we should have Amit once again at Manthan.
Yes. Oh
Amit, this is a standing invitation.
Thank you so much. My God, this has been such a wonderful experience for me. I have to say this, that having this conversation with Pratap is just such a fantastic experience for me, because if somebody would sort of tell me, when I began this work, that at some point I'd be sitting and discussing this book with Pratap, I would have not believed it. And so for me, this is a real privilege. I watch Manthan conversations. My students watch it. So for me to be participating in it is such an honor. Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been wonderful. I also want to thank the New India Foundation for being involved in this.